Hi everyone, and welcome to week 6, where we'll cover case studies and comparisons, ranging from macro-level global histories to local-level micro-histories. Let's start with some basic terminology from the social sciences, some of which may not be regularly used by historians, but which nevertheless highlights some important methodological issues. First is the idea of levels of analysis, which is really just a fancy way of talking about scale. Recall our reading from John Lewis Gaddis from week 4 on how historians can shift between multiple scales, from the macroscopic to the microscopic. Other disciplines have similar conceptual schema. In sociology, there's a delineation between the macro, meso, and micro levels of social reality. In international relations theory, there's a common taxonomical distinction between 3 levels of analysis: individual, domestic, i.e. state or societal, and global/international. We'll look at each of these levels momentarily, but as far as your own perspectives are concerned, the level of analysis that you focus on is determined by what it is that you want to answer, as well as your unit of analysis. So what's a unit of analysis? Again, it's just a fancy way of saying it's the object or thing that you're studying. So, for example, if you're focusing on a country or a region, then your unit of analysis will tend towards the higher levels of analysis. Whereas if you're looking at an individual or a group, your unit of analysis may skew towards the lower levels of analysis. All of these levels of analysis work together. A helpful way to conceive of this is to understand the levels of analysis as a nested hierarchy of constraints. Global flows and interstate relations set possibilities for state structures and social systems, which in turn set possibilities for local actors, although each level also has substantial autonomy. So this isn't to say that local actors are agentless in the face of larger structures. To paraphrase a famous 19th century sociologist, people make their own history, but only under imposed constraints. Practically speaking, that means that even if you're doing a microhistory, you should still account for macro and meso level perspectives, and vice versa. So let's turn to each of these levels of analysis in turn, starting with the big picture approach of the macro level, where the scope of historical analysis is broad, either temporally, in terms of covering a long time period, and or spatially, in terms of a large geographical range. Large-scale historical inquiry undertakes to account for large structural characteristics, processes, and conditions of historical outcomes. As we'll see in our underpinnings class, for example, genocide and mass violence are often intertwined with transnational and global social processes, such as the spread of agriculture, the rise of modernity, nationalism, industrialization, settler colonialism, imperialism, decolonization, and, more recently, climate change. Recall the so-called Annales school that I talked about in week 4, which relegated the normal scope of political and military history to what it saw as like the foam crest atop the ocean of history, whereas its concern with the longue durée instead focused on the slow-moving but powerful currents lying deep beneath the surface of history. A similar type of world historical perspective has recently become very popular in genocide studies, which is moving away from a tendency to compare cases side by side. That approach has had a nasty side effect in terms of identity politics. Instead of a benign, harmonious extension of genocide recognition from one case to another, one group's victimization experience is often traded against another's in a competitive political struggle. This leads at best to contentious searches for the right historical analogy, and at worst to the denial of the other's genocide. We'll talk more in a second about how to make structured comparisons. Anyways, rather than study discrete, stand-alone cases of genocide, a world historical approach to genocide studies looks at the broader interconnections between cases. Thus, rather than the unit of analysis being certain cases or countries, such as the Holocaust or Rwanda, the unit of analysis in this perspective tends to be the international system writ large. Historian Mark Levine's voluminous work demonstrates such a perspective. For example, our reading by him this week looks at the so-called rimlands of Europe during the first half of the 20th century, which was marked by a large-scale structural shift from multi-ethnic empires to mono-ethnic nation-states. We'll read more of his work in both my Underpinnings and Modern Genocides classes, but for now, consider how his unit of analysis is at the macro level. Let's move to the opposite extreme and turn to the micro level, which involves a reduction of scale, either in terms of geographical focus and/or time. In terms of historiography, this methodological approach is known as microhistory. Now, this is not simply a biographical approach, looking at a single person or family, or even a version of local history, looking at a particular place, disconnected from the whole in which it unfolded. Rather, microhistory is a type of observational lens with which to gain understanding and insight into the properties of large-scale global processes and events by looking at the finely textured details of everyday life during the chosen time period under study. In that sense, this approach can provide a very intimate, personal look at historical experience without losing sight of the larger picture, thereby shedding light on the complexities of agency within larger social structures. Microhistory has become increasingly popular in our field, as there's been a recent turn in Holocaust studies towards more fine-grained analyses, focusing on a single camp or ghetto, or a particular roundup, city, convoy, family, or battalion, thereby contributing to a deeper, more granulated perspective of the Holocaust. Omer Bartov's recent book on the town of Bukash is emblematic of this approach, as is Max Burkhaltz's book on the World War II communal-era violence in Kulin Vakuf, a small rural community straddling today's border between northwest Bosnia and Croatia. Other scholars use the micro-lens of an ethnographic approach to examine individual actors, such as Leanne Fuji's examination of the Rwandan genocide in terms of local networks of perpetrators, or Alex Hinton's deep dive into the recent trial of a notorious perpetrator from the Cambodian genocide. We'll talk more about the ethnographic method next week, which involves a very intimate, local-level, immersive approach. Finally, there's this catch-all category in the middle with the meso-level of analysis, which doesn't receive as much attention but is probably the most useful, as it avoids some of the methodological complications with the macro-level approach, which tends to be a bit heavy on structural analyses and less so on issues related to agency, as well as to some of the challenges involved with microhistory and ethnography, which requires ample access to particular sources or extensive fieldwork for ethnographic observation. By working in the middle, the meso-level approach can balance between structural constraints from above and agency from below, thereby showing how individuals and groups make their own histories within the circumstances imposed upon them. Moreover, this approach is attuned to explain local and regional variation within larger episodes, thereby contextualizing emergent factors at the local level with larger structural processes at the macro level. This type of perspective has become increasingly popular in Holocaust and genocide studies, which often looks at the sub-state level of analysis, in terms of particular provinces, states, prefects, or regions. This approach has moved the literature away from explaining episodes of genocide and mass killing as holistic events, and instead toward the disaggregation and explanation of different causal processes and mechanisms at various levels of analysis that play a role in constituting such episodes. Genocides are massively complex social phenomena that incorporate many moving parts at all levels of analysis. Analytic disaggregation of these varied components helps to account for this complexity. For example, the Holocaust is less a single event than many events. Considering how massive in scope the Holocaust was, think about how much diversity in terms of experience and outcome gets glossed over by looking at this case as a distinct, self-evident, and bounded event. Instead of taking this case as a predetermined unit of analysis, we can instead reconsider the Holocaust in terms of multiple clusters of genocidal projects, not just in terms of non-Jewish victims of the Nazis, although that too, but even in terms of the very diverse range of Jewish victims. This mid-level approach also enables us to easily zoom in or out, depending on our analytical needs, thereby moving easily between spatial and temporal boundaries. For example, Umit Ungur's analysis of a single province in eastern Anatolia is anchored during the time period of the Armenian genocide, but extends both beforehand and afterward in order to expose both its preconditions and consequences. Likewise, Kopstein and Wittenberg utilize polling data from interwar Poland to explain the variable occurrence of anti-Jewish pogroms in different communities. Focusing on group polarization, they find that areas that possessed stronger Jewish support for minority political parties that advocated for cultural autonomy created collective perceptions of Jews as outside the community of nation-state solidarity, thereby making pogroms more likely to occur. In sum, given the flexibility of the meso-level approach, I recommend this as a comfortable starting point for most analyses. Finally, let's get back to the tricky issue of comparative history. As noted earlier, the track record of comparative genocide studies has mixed results, although you see here some titles from the best of the lot. Now, I didn't mean to dissuade you all earlier on with my critical remarks about comparative genocide studies. Making comparisons is a very natural thinking activity, but beyond making everyday comparisons, our goal at this level is to do methodologically sound, structured, focused comparisons. So, first of all, what are the intellectual purposes of making comparisons? There are 4 objectives that are increasingly more complex. The first objective of comparative analysis is the process of describing certain cases or units of analysis. Description serves an important component to the research process and ought to precede the other objectives of comparison. Purely descriptive studies thus serve as the raw data for those comparative studies that aspire to higher levels of explanation. The second objective is to establish different conceptual classifications in order to group vast numbers of units into distinct categories with identifiable and shared characteristics. Like contextual description, classification is a necessary component of systematic comparison, but in many ways represents a higher level of comparison, since it seeks to group many separate descriptive entities into simpler categories. So despite the differences between contextual description and classification, both forms of activity contribute to the next objective of comparison, hypothesis testing. In other words, once things have been described and classified, the comparativist can then move on to search for those factors that may help what has been described and classified, thereby producing generalizable theories. The final and most difficult objective is a logical extension of hypothesis testing, namely, to make predictions about outcomes. For those of you who either have or will take my genocide prevention class, predicting or forecasting the probability of future genocides is very much a core purpose for Holocaust and genocide studies. Okay, so that's why we do comparative studies, but how do we do them? Firstly, there's a difference between so-called large N studies and small N studies, with the N representing the number of cases. This difference involves a trade-off between levels of abstraction and scope. Large N studies have a broad scope, including very many units of analysis, and therefore requiring a high level of abstraction. Large N studies almost always involve the use of quantitative analyses, and although such projects are by no means off limits, they are somewhat out of our wheelhouse. Instead, we're better suited towards small N studies, looking at 2, no more than 3 or 4 cases, thereby limiting the scope and simplifying the level of abstraction. Generally speaking, there are 2 ways to compare a few units of analysis: the most similar system design and the most different system of design. The most similar system compares units of analysis that share a host of common features, but nonetheless result in different outcomes. For example, we could look at Nazi Germany and Fascist Spain as 2 similar political systems that had very different outcomes. In contrast, the most different system compares units of analysis that do not share any common features apart from the outcome to be explained. For example, we could look at Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina as 2 different political systems that shared a similar outcome. Okay, and that's it. As usual, we have our discussion forum post this week, as well as our final research proposal. Reach out to me with any questions. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.